Hello, my name is Christopher Hodap, and I have the honor of serving for 2019 and 2020 as the Worshipful Master of the Dwight L. Smith Lodge of Research at UD. For those of you who may not be familiar with us, the Dwight L. Smith Lodge of Research is a special-purpose Masonic lodge under dispensation and created by the Grand Lodge F&AM of Indiana for the purpose of furthering research and interest in the history, customs, and societal impact of the Masonic fraternity. Our mandate is to study these areas from a worldwide perspective, but with a particular emphasis on how they've impacted the lives of Masons, their families, and the general public here in the state of Indiana. In recent years, we've been working more closely with the Masonic Library and Museum of Indiana, located in Indianapolis, to highlight and explore more of their holdings and to try and act as sort of their unofficial research arm. As a result, we hope to be making online recordings of some of our past presentations and make them available on both the lodges and the museum's websites to a wider audience. This recording is our first, and it is a presentation I made in January 2020 about the role that America's, and specifically Indiana's, Freemasons played on the home front during World War II. During the war, at the urging of Freemason and Missouri Senator Harry Truman, America's Masons opened almost 100 recreation centers all over the country for the hundreds of thousands of military servicemen who were mobilized during that conflict. It was an enormous national and local cooperative undertaking on the part of the Masonic fraternity at the time, and they worked in conjunction with the War Department to have unprecedented access to military bases, something few other civilian groups would enjoy. It's appropriate to present as our first recorded lecture because it's being recorded during the global COVID-19 coronavirus shutdown in April 2020. Our oldest members who are still with us today lived through the Great Depression of 1929 into the 1930s and World War II itself. Yet those folks from that generation today are telling us all that despite these great upheavals and later ones like the 9/11 terrorist attacks, they've never lived through anything remotely like this global pandemic that has essentially shut down the entire world. I'm speaking from my living room because we have no real choice right now. Masons in 2020 are asking each other online right now what we could be doing to help our communities, especially since we're almost all being ordered to remain isolated and shut up in our own homes. As you'll see in this presentation, Masons after World War I were disappointed at their own lack of planning and cooperation during that global conflict, and they're resolved not to be caught unawares again. The result was the formation of the Masonic Service Association and this subsequent project they took on. There's a lesson there for all of us today. After the eruption of World War II and the plans they had put into action, Harry Truman said at that time in a national radio address, quote, "None will look askance and say, 'Where was Freemasonry in this hour of need?'" I hope this presentation will foster serious conversations about how Masons can again help their communities and all Americans once the current pandemic subsides and we can get back to work, meeting in person again as brothers and planning for the future. I hope you enjoy it. Hello, my name is Christopher Hodap, and I'm the Worshipful Master of the Dwight L. Smith Lodge of Research for 2019 and 2020 in Indianapolis, Indiana. This is a presentation that I gave at our January 2020 meeting. It's entitled, "Your Son is My Brother, Indiana's Masonic Service Centers of World War II." During World War I, U.S. Grand Lodges were agreed that American Freemasons should band together to help with the war effort. But Masons across the country at the time were woefully disorganized and couldn't manage to agree on a single mission that would both help servicemen and satisfy the government. Chartering American military lodges had fallen out of favor after the Civil War, and throughout the First World War, Grand Lodges everywhere struggled with how to best serve their Masons in the military and help the war effort both at home and overseas. The War Department, these days known as the Department of Defense, refused to work with the chaos of 49 different U.S. Grand Lodges that existed at the time, but they did agree to work with just one centralized agency if the Masons could put one together. So Grand Masters gathered in Cedar Rapids, Iowa in 1918 to discuss laying aside their egos and conflicting rules and formulate the concept of the Masonic Service Association. It was formed officially in November of 1919 to provide services to the Grand Lodges that they couldn't perform as easily individually. The MSA was created to provide services to the military, create informational and educational materials, and to issue disaster relief appeals and distribute donations collected for that purpose. The first executive secretary of the MSA was the eminent Masonic author Carl H. Cloudy, who many of you might recognize as the author of numerous books and short stories, notably The Old Tyler Talks and Introduction to Masonry. In real life, he was actually an early science fiction writer, photographer, journalist, and he even wrote for DC Comics for a while. The Short Talk Bulletin was first printed in January 1923, and it's been published monthly ever since. Ironically enough, given the way the next war would begin, the first disaster relief appeal was issued by the MSA in 1923 for the Grand Lodge of Japan. After the stock market crash in 1929 and the Great Depression that followed, the 1930s would be one of the most violent and turbulent decades in world history. Fascist governments came to power in Italy, France, and Spain in the late 1930s, and Imperial Japan was flexing its military might in China and the Far East at the same time. U.S. War Department planners realized if another world war came, its scope would be even greater than the Great War that had ended in 1918. They planned what they knew could possibly become the greatest mobilization of military troops the world would ever see. In the East, China invaded Manchuria in 1931, and war would break out again with China in 1937. In the West, once Hitler's Nazi forces rolled into Czechoslovakia in 1938, it was clear it would take a miracle for the U.S. to remain out of the growing wars enveloping the world again. Here's what would happen with the U.S. military between the 1930s and after the breakout of World War II in 1939, and then after Pearl Harbor at the end of 1941. U.S. population in 1940 was about 130 million. By 1945, almost 10% of the nation's entire population was in uniform. With that in mind, early in 1941, President Franklin Roosevelt called upon 6 civilian organizations to band together and form the USO, the United Service Organization, the Salvation Army, the Young Men's Christian Association, the YMCA, the Young Women's Christian Association, the YWCA, the National Catholic Community Service, and National Travelers Aid Association, and the National Jewish Welfare Board all cooperated with the government to build and operate USO centers throughout the U.S. to help boost morale of what everyone knew would be increasing waves of servicemen. But the Masonic Service Association and its executive secretary, Carl Cloudy, were already way ahead of them in their own planning stages, and when it looked like America might soon be going to war again, they had a plan. In July 1941, Missouri Senator and past Grand Master Harry S. Truman gave a national radio address entitled Masonry Serves the Armed Forces, in which he outlined programs being proposed by the Masonic Service Association to help aid and assist servicemen in the event of war, and he exhorted brethren across the country to get busy immediately putting them into practice. It was clear that war in Europe and Asia were coming to the American soldiers sooner or later, and Truman's radio message was the official call to action for the nation's Freemasons not to make the same mistakes as they had 3 decades before. Truman's encouragement would become even more influential to Masons and the public in general, as he would soon be named as Roosevelt's vice presidential running mate. By the way, where it says Harry S. Truman with no period after the S, that's for an unusual reason. Harry Truman had no middle name, he simply had the initial S, and because it didn't actually stand for anything, he properly didn't put a period after the S. Between 1941 and 1945, more than 16 million American men and women would eventually serve in the U.S. Armed Forces, and another 3.5 million worked as federal civilian employees during the war. Those are all sobering statistics today in an age when just 0.5% of Americans are in uniform. Never before would so many Americans be uprooted from the familiar surroundings of their homes, families, and communities and moved to so many unfamiliar regions of the nation and the world with so little preparation and support. The more than 2.5 million U.S. Freemasons across the country had a major stake in the lives of military personnel. By 1944, during the height of the war, the MSA would estimate 25% of all servicemen and women were either Masons or from the families of Masons. After the attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, the Grand Lodge of Indiana responded to America's rendezvous with destiny. They had already established a War Service and Relief Committee chaired by past Grand Master Claude M. Jacoby. Their first order of business was to send pledges of solidarity and support to the governor of Indiana and a fellow Freemason, President Roosevelt. At the annual communication the next May, the Grand Lodge enacted an annual $2 per capita assessment, equivalent to $25 in 2019, on all Masons in the state for the War Service and Relief Fund. The state was divided up according to congressional districts, a simple process with clearly established official boundaries. District representatives were elected from among the sitting worshipful masters of Indiana's lodges. Indiana's Masons worked closely with commanders of military bases throughout the state. The committee appointed field agents and hostesses from among Masons, their wives, and families. Because of Freemasonry's acclaimed reputation and popularity at the time, special Masonic military identification cards were issued, and field agents and hostesses were given the extraordinary ability to gain entry onto the various Army bases and Navy bases, posts, camps, and stations. They would assist servicemen by providing transportation, meeting them at arriving or departing trains, writing letters, running errands off base, or just knowing where to go on a 24-hour pass in an unfamiliar town. When a soldier needed something that involved the civilian world off base, the Masons took care of it. Indiana's Masons would also assist with providing emergency transportation, temporary housing, and hospitalization needs for the immediate families of soldiers. Meanwhile, there were more ambitious plans set in motion. Years before the attack on Pearl Harbor and America's entry into World War II, the National Masonic Service Association had done a national survey of Masonic halls and military bases. It was determined that they already had ideal social facilities sitting in nearly every American city and town, large and small, in the form of existing Masonic temples. The post-World War I building boom of the 1920s meant the Masons had plenty of big, centrally located buildings that could accommodate visiting soldiers in large numbers. With a little bit of work, combined with their own dedicated volunteers from within the wider Masonic family of organizations, the Masonic Service Centers were born. The first center was officially opened in 1941 in the large Masonic Temple in Columbus, South Carolina. By the war's end, there were about 90 centers worldwide. The Masonic Service Centers were designed to address the huge morale problem of hundreds of thousands of young soldiers far from home for the first time in their lives, suddenly finding themselves in strange towns without friends or relatives. The centers provided recreation like pool tables and card games, local newspapers from around the country and the world, foreign maps to help understand the global conflict and their own destinations, letter writing material and postage, and free phone calls to the folks back home. They would even arrange for cashing out-of-town checks for soldiers, something that was normally quite difficult in the age before ATMs and credit cards. Centers frequently provided regular food services in their dining halls and sponsored dances and entertainment on weekends. Sojourning Masons in the military were able to connect with local lodges or work on their proficiency far from home with a sympathetic brother. Men who had only received their first or second degrees in their mother lodges back home before being drafted or signing up for duty were granted dispensations, and Indiana lodges would confer the rest of their degree work before they were shipped overseas. But while the centers were certainly finding ways to cater specifically to Masons, they were open to any service member, which earned the blessing of the Armed Forces top brass. Many non-Masons visiting the centers would later seek out membership once they returned home, specifically because of the kindness shown to them by the Masonic fraternity.
As a past Grand Master of the great state of Missouri, I'm very much interested in the Masonic Service Association. In the last war, we had 49 Grand Lodges trying to do the work of one. In unity is strength. This time, when our boys come marching home victorious, none will look askance and say, "Where was Freemasonry in this hour of need?" Approximately 10% of the boys in the service are Freemasons. Another 15% are close kin of Freemasons. Through the association, Freemasonry is meeting the challenge of their great need. At this very moment, in foxholes and on shipboard, beneath the sea and in the air, countless hands are being clasped in fraternal recognition as brothers find one another in the darkness as well as in the daylight. And countless fathers, bravely wishing Godspeed to their departing sons, are saying, "Boy, when your hour of darkness and loneliness comes, find a Freemason and tell him you're the son of a Freemason, and you'll find a friend." And through our great association, the flower of Freemasonry is being made to bloom in the rocky soil of war's desolation. And the fruits of Freemasonry are being shared by every boy and girl who wears the uniform. There's nothing for sale in Masonic Service Centers. Neither mineral nor metal is the price of Freemasonry service to our boys. And yet, our centers are supported without fanfare or public appeal, because in our heart glows the great light of charity, unostentatious but sincere. Each of us giving generously because we have seen the light and heard the cry of the widow's son.
Indiana's War Service and Relief Committees at first pursued setting up several regional Masonic centers close to the major bases and military hospitals around the state. But they soon determined that duplication of services in too many places would be less effective. By January 1944, they shifted plans and concentrated on large Masonic service centers in the large downtown Masonic temples in both Indianapolis and Evansville. Evansville's location on the Ohio River gave it the distinction during the war of having the largest inland waterway shipyard in the country, and great numbers of LST landing craft were launched from its docks every single week. Indianapolis' central location was ideal because of Fort Benjamin Harrison with its major induction and training center, the Army Air Corps Stout Field just east of downtown, and the large Indianapolis Veterans Hospital. It also served Camp Atterbury to the south, plus Seymour's Freeman Airfield, the Peru Naval Air Station, now Grissom Air Force Base, and Fort Wayne's Bear Field, all in the north. Evansville Center began operating in January 1944, and it would quickly become to be known as the Army-Navy Masonic Center. It was incredibly popular and was open 7 days a week. The center had a recreation area with pool and ping pong tables, writing desks, couches and chairs, card tables, a radio and jukebox. Newspapers from all over the world were subscribed to, so soldiers could keep track of news both at home and abroad. Dances were held in the Evansville Temple's ballroom every Saturday with a live orchestra, and young women called the Masonic Service Cadets, made up of ladies of the Eastern Star, Job's Daughters, and Rainbow Girls, volunteered to make sure servicemen had dance partners. Occasionally, the cadets would also be bused to nearby Camp Breckenridge, Kentucky, to attend dances there. Propriety was assured because of Masonic obligations to respect the wives and daughters of fellow brethren. The Indianapolis Masonic Center in its downtown temple was officially christened in February that same year with a crowd of 150 on its opening night. An average of 6,500 service members visited the Indianapolis Center every month throughout 1944. The basement under the main lobby was refurbished and modified to create its recreation center and military lounge. The Order of the Eastern Star formed a Victory Club, and free home-cooked meals were available every day in the second-floor dining room, supervised by their indefatigable cook, Mrs. Nina Sims. A short-order lunch counter was also installed in the basement with a smaller kitchen for times when large meals weren't available. The first floor also housed the Grand Lodge Library and what is now the Masonic Home Foundation office. Outdoors, the area south of the temple that now serves as a parking lot was a grassy lawn until the 1940s, and croquet and horseshoe courts were installed for the center. Originally, the temple's tiled roof had been used as a drill team practice area by Raper Commandery's Knights Templar and as an outdoor party deck with its sweeping view of the city. But the center drew far more soldiers and ladies for dances on Friday nights that could be accommodated on the rooftop. So to handle the wartime crowds and also have room for a band, the south lawn was replaced with a concrete pad, and strings of electric light bulbs were suspended over it so dancing could last well into the night. Homesickness was cited as the biggest issue volunteers at the centers had to deal with. So many new recruits had never been away from home in their lives and frequently just needed an attentive and sympathetic ear, which the cadets were trained to provide. One of the biggest expenses at the centers was providing free long-distance telephone calls to servicemen. We don't think of that much today, but because phone rates were so astronomical at that time, special drawings would eventually be held for visitors to award free calls and cigarettes, and only hospital-bound servicemen would ultimately be given telephone money without any questions asked. By the end of 1944, Indiana's 2 Masonic Service Centers had welcomed soldiers and sailors from 46 of the 48 states, plus England, Scotland, Canada, Australia, Mexico, and the Philippines. Indiana's Masonic Centers were financed entirely by the generosity of Masons, the appendant bodies, and their families. They received no funding from the USO or any other federal agency. Many religious groups also sponsored their own similar sorts of social centers for soldiers. But in public notices about the Masonic Centers, it was stressed that they were open to all service personnel regardless of Masonic affiliation, race, creed, or color. That made them different from other church-related centers in the state or private membership clubs that often had racial or religious restrictions which were so common at the period. On December of 1944, the War Service and Relief Committee's chairman, past Grand Master Jacoby, received news that his own son's plane had disappeared over Japan, bringing the devastating losses of war to his own doorstep. Determined to do all he could for America's servicemen, he redoubled his efforts and expanded the Grand Lodge's program to a different venue. In January 1945, the committee contracted with a professional entertainment agency and began providing weekly musical, comedy, and theatrical shows at Fort Harrison's Billings Hospital, Camp Atterbury's Wakeman Hospital, and the Indianapolis Veterans Hospital. When bedridden patients couldn't make it into the hospital's auditoriums, the shows would take to the hallways, and patients' beds were wheeled out to their doorways so no one was left without entertainment. The Freemasons were the only organization in the state to provide this type of service to hospitalized soldiers. In addition to spending $2,000 a month on the centers alone, about $28,000 in 2019 dollars, the War Service and Relief Committee also had established a rehabilitation fund for lodges so they could request funds to support their own wounded or disabled members returning from the war. The Veterans Administration came into being during the war, and it was understood that the government would eventually take on the expenses of assisting returning wounded veterans. But the Grand Lodge created the fund as a temporary measure to fill in while the government took its time in responding to the need. By 1948, Indiana's Freemasons would eventually contribute $110,000 to the Rehabilitation Fund alone, equivalent to nearly $1.6 million today. Just between January 1944 and the official end of the war in August of 1945, Indiana's Masons hosted more than 80,000 service personnel at its 2 Masonic centers. Agents, hostesses, and cadets wrote thousands of letters and made hundreds of phone calls on behalf of soldiers unable to contact home on their own, and even communicated with lodges in other jurisdictions to report on the status of their military members while in the state. Throughout the course of the war, an average of 100 soldiers a day came through each center. After the war ended, soldiers and sailors were still being sent across the country and the globe in the slow return to national normalcy. Indiana's Masonic centers remained open until June 30th of 1946. In the end, the very first Masonic Service Center at Columbus, Georgia, was one of the last to close in December of 1946. Harry Truman assumed the presidency upon the death of Franklin Roosevelt in 1945. After the conclusion of the war, President Truman and Carl Cloudy still saw an ongoing purpose for the fraternity and the MSA's national leadership in helping the military. At Truman's encouragement, the Masonic volunteerism of the service centers was converted to the MSA's hospital visitation program in 1947, which continues to this very day. That little talked about program and its Masonic volunteers today provide companionship and assistance to U.S. veterans in 150 VA hospitals and more than 40 state veterans hospitals, homes, and extended care facilities around the country. That current mission is an extension of what was done during World War II for the same reasons, bringing comfort to service personnel confined to their hospital beds and far from their homes, friends, and family. Just as a reminder, the MSA is always looking for new volunteers to take on these visitations today, along with soliciting funds to keep providing these services. Next time you get their envelope appeal in the mail, that's what it's for. You might send them a donation. It's sad to think that more civilians know more about this program these days than our own members do. No real visual remnant of the service center survives today at Indianapolis Masonic Temple in Freemasons Hall, apart from the counter from the small kitchenette that used to be in the basement. The pool tables that used to be downstairs are now on the 7th floor and used by the DLS chapter boys, and the 1940s jukebox still survives and was hidden away in an 8th floor storeroom until recently. It's on display today at the Masonic Library Museum of Indiana. Thanks so much for listening and watching, and I hope you've enjoyed this presentation.